Thank you, and thank you very much for inviting me to do this. And I've always considered, since I was given life membership of AULRE in 2016, that that was one of the things I was most proud of. I was rather feeling my life flashing before me with that very comprehensive introduction that you gave, Pat, but I shall take it from here, as long as you can all see my PowerPoint and screen. Yes?
Good. PowerPoint's good.
PowerPoint's good. Okay. Now I just got to make sure I can move it on. Not at the moment. Yes. So, being non-binary. So, criticism of binary thinking has a very long history, especially if you take account of Eastern as well as Western philosophy. But actually identifying as being non-binary is something much more recent. And you will probably be most familiar with it in relation to gender, people whose preferred pronouns are they or them rather than her or him, and sexuality, the B in LGBT plus plus plus. The first person, as far as I know, to apply it to the religious, non-religious binary, you may know different, I'll be very pleased to know if you do, was Richard Holloway, who was the ex-Bishop of Edinburgh, you may know, and theologian. And I have got a reference for this, but I first heard him while I was doing the ironing and vaguely listening to Radio 4, which is the sort of thing you do when you're retired. And he was talking about his own personal religion, and he used this term about being non-binary between religious and non-religious. And I thought, what a brilliant idea. And so he is to be credited in my knowledge of knowing this term and applying it to religion and non-religion. I've no idea when it was first used in RE. I couldn't even remember when I first used it myself, and I was trying to track down some of my publications over the last few years. And I seem to have I did use it in an ARIAC keynote speech in 2018, which is still available on RE Online as part of the primary ITT tutor toolkit. And I found that I had actually talked about Richard Holloway and being non-binary there. The first sort of real academic journal article to talk about this is Odder and Broughton's recent article in BJRE 2021, where she talked about non-binary worldviews as being having a lot of potential for use in RE. And then I seem to have written about it in print and used it in book chapters in 2020 and 2021. But another thing I would recommend to you is Peter Ninas from Finland, religious studies person, who didn't use the term being non-binary in the article that I have made great use of. But I was very grateful to a colleague from Finland for recommending this to me, because I wouldn't have found it being in a psychology journal. And incidentally, he also, in passing, approves of worldview studies. So this is a very excellent and useful article. So what am I going to be talking about? It's going to be somewhat a circular wander rather than a linear argument. I tried very hard to put it into a linear argument because I prefer to follow things in a neat order, but it wouldn't fit. So I'm going to be talking about a variety of things and in a rather circular way. My own personal experience, what is religion anyway? Indian traditions and paganism, the phenomenon of multi-religious belonging and the nones, problems with the religious secular divide, being non-binary, and the implications for RE and worldviews. So I'm going to start with personal experience. When I stopped being a sixth form teacher and eventually started helping out with RE at Basvar, decades and decades ago, the slogan was, you have to start with the children's experience. And I've always thought that that was a wise saying, that things won't work unless your audience or the children you're working with can relate to it. And you may have noticed how fashionable the authority of lived experience is, not just in religious studies circles, but all over the place in the media. And it made me wonder, can you have experience that's not lived? Probably not, but perhaps it's an intensifier, lived experience. So I'm going to start with lived experience. Like myself, everybody in you're all in the RE world somehow or other. You may well have been asked, but are you religious yourself when you explain to people what you do? Whether it's students in a classroom saying, are you religious, miss? Or at those sorts of parties where the small talk has to be something like, and what do you do? And you have to say, well, I'm an RE teacher. And then you get various interesting reactions, such as apologies for swearing, or they rush off and talk to somebody else. So you will have, all of you, been asked this question. So how do you answer? And I suppose it may be okay if you're a card-carrying member of a particular denomination, and I'm happy to share that. But it's not very easy if you're not quite sure how to answer. And for me, it's got more and more difficult over the decades. And it's not just me who finds this difficult. I was rather pleased to find that lots of other people too, and very much enjoyed reading an article by Mark Plater, who researched with his students on Halloween in primary schools. And he sent the students out with questionnaires to talk about what customs people did. And one of the questions was, are your family religious? And the pupils found this very, very difficult. And I love this phrase, key stage 2 pupils, that's the 7 to 11-year-olds, sometimes expressed confusion about it, wondering what it meant to be religious. And I thought, join the club, children. And it was the hardest question, he said, the hardest question that the students asked, his students asked the children. So I'm going to start with a brief biography of my identity in the spirit of no one stands nowhere. I won't bore you too much. You've heard enough of my life from Pet, I think, but I'll do it very quickly. I started off as a Roman Catholic, rather liberal sort, liberal Christian, and I taught in a Roman Catholic sixth form college until 1986, when the labels didn't seem to fit anymore. And I mentioned, my liberalism had gone so far that I looked at myself in the mirror one day and thought, okay, you call yourself a Catholic and a Christian, but apart from this and apart from that, and that bit that I don't believe and that bit that I don't do. And I said, be honest, how does this differ from not actually being a Catholic or a Christian at all? At which point I decided to be honest and resigned my post as head of religious education, because I thought it wasn't fair to be representing something that I felt that label no longer fitted me. But I didn't find a new label. I didn't convert to something else. And so after 1986 up until today, it's caused some difficulties and some distress sometimes. I remember way back in the 80s being at an interfaith conference, and everybody was going around literally with a label. You had a label to put on yourself saying Hindu or Quaker or whatever you were. And I didn't know what to put on my label. And I found that quite distressing because I didn't want to put agnostic. That's never sounded quite right to me. Too negative. I don't know. And I do know lots of things. I wanted something that would express a positive identity. I do have my own positive identity, my own values, my practices, my beliefs. They just don't fit in the boxes. Then in the early 90s, I found myself in the USA trying to explain what the multi-faith non-confessional RE that we were doing in the UK, or at least in England and Wales at the time, how it differed from what was happening in America, whereas, of course, as you know, they don't officially have RE as a subject in state-funded schools. And I was reflecting on the pluralism all around me in the United States, and that the whole place was set up to allow freedom of religion, and that anybody could be anything they wanted. But I found it kind of a negative pluralism. You could get on with your own little practices in the privacy of your own home, but you weren't allowed to talk about it in the classroom. And people were very twitchy about it. And despite the fact that sometimes on the classroom walls, the classrooms I visited, there were sayings that I recognised as being from the Buddha, but nobody knew that, so it was part of moral education or something. But I came up with the term positive pluralist, that I'm a pluralist, but in a positive way. And so instead of having no symbols of any religions allowed in your classroom, you have all the symbols of all the religions, as in many an English, British RE classroom. And then that got turned into a bit of a label for both an approach to RE and a personal identity. In recent years, I've been to some extent involved with the Sea of Faith network. which you could caricature as being religious positive atheists and agnostics, perhaps. Religion as a human creation, rejecting the metaphysical claims, but nevertheless seeing religion as a positive thing to be explored and celebrated. But I'm not quite 100% at home in the sea of faith because perhaps I'm a bit too religious. It's not some of religion. Obviously, lots of religion is a human creation, but is it all? And I found myself in 2017 at two different conferences in the summer, which kind of amused me because I was at the Sea of Faith conference and the conference of the Church's Fellowship for Psychical and Spiritual Studies. And both of these groups are kind of on the margins of Christianity, mainstream Christianity. Sea of Faith perhaps too rational, and the Church's Fellowship too weird and into unusual psychic phenomena and such like, but both very genuine, very interesting. I would sort of summarize it by saying the Sea of Faith people would say, well, obviously angels are metaphorical of whatever. And the people in the Church's Fellowship say, well, I met one yesterday. So, and both of them found themselves not really at home in the mainstream churches, because the people who'd had the religious experiences that seemed strange to other people, but very subjectively convincing, they went to talk to their priest and that freaked him out. And likewise, some people who will say very clearly that they don't believe in God separate from human, human creation, are both on the two margins of Christianity. So I've never liked binary thinking since childhood, and finally later on in life studying Indian traditions helped. And during the 2 years of the commission, we were thinking about diversity and complexity, and somewhere in that time I came across Richard Holloway and his being non-binary, and I found that personally very liberating. I finally had something to write on my label. And the Religious Education Council's Worldviews project, carrying on from the commission, and the concept of personal worldview and how that's developing, I also found very useful. And it seems that criticism of binary thinking is in, or at least on the air. I mentioned my ability to listen to radio far more than I used to do when I was working, but I've been listening to programs on culture wars and the death of nuance. People are starting to criticize this idea that there's, you're either in this camp or that camp, and this sort of thinking's in the air. So when you get asked that question, are you religious? The first answer is obvious. It depends what you mean by religion, and what is religion anyway? And this is probably ground that many people have covered. I don't want to spend too much time on it. For me, it was, as Americans would say, study of religions 101. For many years, I taught the introductory course to study of religions along with my colleagues. And the first two sessions were on what is religion and what is spirituality. And so we've all kind of rehearsed this for many years. But there's a lot of talk about the current negative. Linda Woodhead called it even toxic view of the word religion, the R word. Don't mention it. And many popular associations, this is summarising wildly, it's about unscientific truth claims, those people who think the world was created in 6 days, oppressive organisations full of paedophiles, illiberal and old-fashioned social attitudes when it comes to gender or sexuality, unthinking obedience to strict laws. It causes wars. And you have to take the whole package. A lot of people don't call anybody religious unless you do absolutely everything that's in the package. And it was quite interesting. You've probably done something similar. So word association with religion and spirituality. Even study of religion students who'd chosen to do this subject, most of the things on the top of their head were dogma and strict rules and things came out associated with religion, and with spirituality it was more cuddly and personal and generally sort of sounded better. They didn't like my definition of spirituality as possibly like religion, only vaguer. They were rather upset about that one, and they went off to find their own better ones. But it's not a new phenomenon, because in this September, it will be 50 years since I went to university to study theology. And even before that, even in a Catholic school as I was at, people thought I was a bit bonkers. The teachers, even the nuns, were saying, "Are you sure? Don't you think you should do medicine or law or something sensible like that?" But off I went to do theology. And from that day onwards, I've always had these embarrassing things since Freshers Week. What are you doing? Theology. And then they feel free to say all sorts of things. You will have been there, some of you. Even many so-called religious adherents would prefer to say a way of life. How many times have you heard religion X spokesperson say, well, ism, it's not a religion, it's a way of life. And although I'm mocking it, it's, you know what they mean. Quick summary of the scholarly critique. The idea of separate monolithic belief systems, most scholars would agree, is a recent Western invention. We didn't used to think like that, pre-Enlightenment and pre the 19th century even. Modelled on Christianity. So one of the problems with the concept is it's model, it's a European model with God and scripture and creed and church, and everybody else has to be squeezed into that model. Most scholars would argue, or many, that religion and religions don't exist out there in the real world. It's concept, construct. It's particularly unhelpful when it comes to dharmic traditions. Some scholarly suggestions: we could drop it altogether. Let's just never say the word religion again and replace it with culture. Tim Fitzgerald argued that even using the category religion is covert theology. You are really siding with the believers, if you like. Whereas I'm not happy with culture, although lots of other people would rather use culture, if you noticed, than religion. It's sort of easier to relate to for some people, but it tends to side with the other side, doesn't it? Because the definition of culture is human created. Then notice Vivienne's here, your great hero. William Cantwell Smith, replacing religion with faith for the personal side and tradition for the community dimensions. I find I use tradition quite a lot. I don't use faith so much, even though that's quite popular with a lot of people. I think perhaps it might put too much stress on belief for me, but interfaith and faith groups and faith-based, a lot of people think that sounds a little bit more acceptable than religion. Jonathan said Smith has argued that it is just a word, it is just a tool of scholarship, it's a useful term, but we scholars have made it up for themselves. Russell McCutcheon would argue, well, forget just scholars, you can define religion for yourself. But he added that this is a political act. So if you say something, which I thought that was quite a useful thing to have added to the discussion, if you call something religious, it's a political act with real world consequences. And if you think about India, for example, there's an argument that the British made communal tensions a lot worse by inventing these categories and saying you're Sikhs, you're Hindus, you're Muslims, in a way that people didn't think quite the same way before. So in colonial times and even now, arguments over whether people can wear hijab in schools, whether you call something all religious or not, does have real world consequences up to and including life and death. And you may want to think about examples for yourself. Wandering back to dharmic traditions, the chapter in Pat and Gert's book that goes back to a conference that we had quite a while ago in 2017, my colleague Catherine and myself wrote a chapter about how the Western concept of religion doesn't really work so well with dharmic traditions or pagan traditions or indigenous traditions. Not surprising, because it's modelled on Christianity. And these are some of the problems, just to rehearse them. In dharmic traditions, they're not unitary, they're not exclusive with fixed boundaries, or at least I have to say they weren't. I fear that they are becoming so and having difficult real world consequences because of that, but they didn't used to be. There was a joke that if I asked a Nepali person, are you a Hindu or a Buddhist, they'd just say yes. Buddhist, Jain and some Hindu traditions are not based on God. That's one of the reasons I used to like doing Buddhism, especially in school, because it's not based on God. And God seems to be the first thing that springs to people's mind when they think about religion in the West, rather like a badly trained Ofsted inspector in an assembly trying to work out if it's actually fulfilling the law to be mainly or wholly of a broadly Christian Watch out for did they mention the word God? Concept of divine, this is wildly generalizing. If there is a divine, it tends to be more immanent than transcendent. In Dharmic traditions, more impersonal than personal. Not really true what I've just said there, but you know what I mean. There's no one wholly revealed scripture. There's either stacks and stacks of texts, such as the Tibetan canon, or there are no written texts in such as in contemporary paganism or some indigenous traditions. And many scholars of Dharmic traditions would say it's not so much about believing, as in the Christian creed, it's more about doing. It's not about truth claims, it's about being. And it's distorted if it's mapped onto a Christian model. Now, one of the reasons that I've been interested in studying paganism is that not just because I'm interested in paganism, because I loved witches ever since I was at primary school, but it's indicative of a new sort of religiosity, contemporary paganism. So I'm not just interested in it for itself, but for what it kind of symbolises and represents. Ironically, many pagans themselves want the label religion. I have a colleague who's written many thick books about paganism as a world religion. And because often until recently, this was denied by outsiders. So contemporary pagans have had to fight to get the label religion. And as recently as 2015, one of the major interfaith groups finally let them in. But it does illustrate a kind of new religiosity where, again, summarising wildly, the individual and their experience is the authority, not a text and not a great leader. It's eclectic, drawing upon several traditions, and I've often been quite amused listening to pagans talk, and they will include words like karma, or talk about chakras, and so probably they do know about the history from where this comes from, maybe they do, maybe they don't. There's a stress on ritual and story and myth rather than on doctrines, very much anti-dogmatic. There's no sort of list of you must believe this. When it comes to ethics, it's very liberal, with the Wiccan saying being typical, "An it harm none, do what thou wilt." Though, as everybody knows, it sounds very similar to a Christian saying. And once you start ruling out what harms somebody or something, there's not often quite a lot of what thou wilt is not left. I also like the archaic language. While some Christian groups are trying to get away from archaic language, pagans are kind of deliberately, or some pagans are deliberately adopting it. There are more feminist and queer influences on paganism, partly reflecting its time and on nature and in the environment. So where there is a divine, the divine is immanent in nature. And there's something that I've called the conscious human creation of religion. There's one of my visits to Glastonbury a few years ago, I came across a goddess and said, "Who's that?" And it was told it was Nullava, and I panicked and thought, "Oh no, I'm religiously illiterate." I thought I was good at goddesses, Hindu goddesses and Egyptian goddesses and Celtic goddesses. I'd never heard of Nullava. And then I looked at the word again and realised it was Avalon backwards. And so this goddess was a recent creation, consciously so. I mean, you could say that she was a recently creation, the name was new, but what she represented was the spirit of the place, which perhaps is not new. But other people have made similar lists to me, noticing this new sort of religiosity. We have spoken a lot about the changing religious landscape in recent years. And so I'd like to talk briefly, or remind you briefly, about multi-religious belonging and the nones. Peter Ninas says, contemporary religious subjects are situated in a different context. The world has changed and religious belonging is different. And many people's research has revealed an increasing number of people who have a multi-religious belonging, including those of mixed heritage. Eleanor Nesbitt talked about, my mum's a Sikh, my dad's a Hindu, or perhaps the other way around. And she talked about people being existentially interfaith. And then there's this eclectic new religiosity. I've been collecting names for it, but I've limited myself to 3. Patchwork religiosity. I rather like whateverism, which is apparently a translation of a Dutch word. Maybe that would be my label, a whateverist. and the bricolage and other similar things. Oostveen, if that's how I pronounce his name. I don't know if this is helpful or not. I haven't quite decided yet, but he's identified hard, medium, soft, multiple belongings. The hard one is if you belong to two traditions. You say, I'm a Christian Buddhist. Or you have a home tradition, that's a medium. You are a Christian, but I also do Zen meditation. Or if you don't want to identify with any particular tradition, then that's soft multiple belonging, which is possibly a bit where I am. Lots of research by all the people researching on non-religion reveals an increasing number of nons. It'd be very interesting. Can't wait for the new census results. Not that I always think they tell us exactly what's going on. But when people tick non-religious, what on earth do they mean? It's almost worse than when they tick religious. It covers many diverse beliefs and values and practices and identities, including aspects that other people might classify as religious. And so there's all this going on. And I found it unsurprising that those with other non-binary identities, the book I mentioned earlier was mainly written about gender and sexuality. But as I was reading this book, I thought, lots bits of this sound Buddhist and pagan to me. And then further on in the book, the two writers identified with Buddhist and pagan backgrounds or interests. And it just seemed, and I think people with various non-binary or non-mainstream identities find themselves more welcome in Buddhist and pagan circles than in some other traditions. So onto the religious secular divide. It's not really new to talk about this, to point out the difficulty either of defining or separating these two labels, and in some times and places and cultures and languages, it's not even an issue. If you think back into the past and various other cultures, I remember having a conversation with a colleague from Botswana at some RE conference somewhere, and I was trying to ask, do you have children from non-religious backgrounds in your classes? And she said, you can't really even ask that question in Setswana because just the words are not there. And there's people who study Japanese religions, so-called, argue about whether the concept of religion ever existed in Japan or whether it's an import from the West. And it's particularly unhelpful, this divide, in the new context. So Nina says, neither the category of religion nor the concept of secularity provides sufficient tools for understanding the emerging complexity. And I remember, Bob, you wrote something on, it was to do with the concept of post-secular, which sounded similar, this complex mixture of religion and secularity. And Audrey Broughton cites me in her article I'm going to mention later, and I was writing an editorial and I found examples of the complex mix of religious and secular in things as varied as 19th century Indian Muslim education, religious Zionist schools in Israel, human rights education, the Resilience Project, and back to Mark on celebrating Halloween in the primary school. It's so deeply entangled that it's just hard to maintain. So religion's tricky, so's secular, so's non-religious, and often very hard to disentangle. And they are convenient terms for organising our thinking, but need constant critique. So it's all very well having this scholarly debate about what do words mean and when can we use it and would there be better words. And I used to sometimes think the poor students must get completely fed up about all of this, but it does have meaning in practice. And I discovered that Naomi Thompson is about to start or has started a project on the use of religious narratives in secular funerals, challenging narratives of religious decline. So you may think something secular and you go to it. I've been to rather too many funerals in recent years, so you get to that age when you do. Something that claims to be secular or civil, you notice lots of religious elements. And civil funerals, which began in 2002, those are the ones that have a celebrant rather than a minister of religion. They often contain a mixture of what you might call religious and what you might call secular. And I don't think anybody, perhaps Naomi's going to do this, anybody's done, we've got statistics on this yet, but anecdotally, over half of civil funerals, and certainly ones I've been to, have this mixture of what you might label religious and what you might label secular. However, as you probably know, civil weddings that were started back in the 1950s, I think, must have no religious content to be legal. Although you might get away with some dharmic or pagan content. I've been amused to find some books full of readings for non-religious weddings. And again, you can see things that really have echoes of dharmic worldviews or pagan worldviews, but people haven't noticed because it didn't say God. So I'm going to be personal again now, because Dave and I, when we finally decided to get married, we wanted a non-binary and positive pluralist wedding. And we had a last-minute panic because we had planned a mixture of so-called secular and so-called religious. And we knew that you couldn't have religious in a secular wedding ceremony, so we were going to have a secular wedding ceremony and then follow it separately with some religious blessings. But the venue organizer had a panic and said, it's not allowed. We're not allowed to have religious ceremonies in this building, and it's part of our license, and we'll all get closed down. But I was amused to find that this building, which is a deconsecrated chapel, just to add to the confusion, allowed hand fasting ceremonies. So that's what pagans call wedding ceremonies. So again, I was amused that you could get away with it if it wasn't Christianity. So David would say, well, let's have a look at your license. And so we brought to bear all our sort of legalistic, exegetical, interpreting text skills. And we said, let's have a look at the license. Yes, it says the building is not licensed for any religious ceremonies, but it says building there. It doesn't say the garden, does it? So we got around it. So we were able to have our non-binary positive pluralist wedding by having a civil ceremony with the registrar, not mention anything religious-ish, in the deconsecrated chapel, followed by some blessings from friends and of ours from different traditions. We thought we had to limit it to 4, otherwise our guests would be desperately wanting their meal. So we had the ones that we'd be most involved with in our studies: Christian, Buddhist, pagan, and Hindu. And you can see the people there, including the pagan was a priestess from the Goddess Temple in Glastonbury, and my colleagues Kevin, Mahinda, and an ex-student from Hare Krishna. So I was very pleased to be able to follow this up. So we had a tent in the garden. So the difference between religious and secular was about £253 to hire a marquee. So I was delighted to later get a Muslim blessing at an Israel meeting later that year. So dharmic traditions and non-binary thinking. I'm just watching the time. Back to dharmic traditions. I think there are great liberating effects from non-Western philosophy, that everything's not true or false. You have ideas like true, truer, and truest, such as the ideas of Neo-Vedanta, that polytheism, there are many gods, but in one sense, but in a higher sense, they're all aspects of the one. In an even higher sense, that is symbolic of the underlying Brahman. ISKCON, Hare Krishna would turn it round, and theism would be a higher expression of monism. You also find ideas like in Buddhism, the raft. Religious doctrines are not sort of set in stone and sacred in themselves. They're a means to an end. They're something to get you from A to B. The skillful means of Mahayana Buddhism. The idea of levels of truth. There's conventional truth and ultimate truth. And the Buddhist idea of known changing self. I particularly like the Jain concept of Anekantavada. I'm hurrying this a bit in the light of needing to get round to... I think I started a bit late, so I'll allow myself a bit longer. The Jain concept of Anekantavada, or non-one-sidedness, when I first came across that, I loved it. Relative pluralism is one way of translating it. Everything, you can't just say something, there's not one side to it. And my interpretation of this is that all statements about reality can only be partially true because they come from a particular perspective and because they're flawed by use of language. So, much to my delight, what sounds contradictory can both be true. And so knowledge is provisional for all except the omniscient. You do have omniscient people in Mahayana Buddhism and in Jainism, but for the rest of us, we are required to be epistemologically humble. Now, when it comes to identity as binary, Linus again says the categories we impose on people are not necessarily in correspondence with how they live and experience their lives. That was my experience. I didn't want the categories. We reject the boxes. One of my students a few years ago, it was after the first census, and Paul Weller had done a similar bit of research on university students and staff and what they believed. And his results was rather different because he'd included you were allowed to tick pagan or spiritual. And that was led to both pagan and spiritual coming much higher up the list. And she tried to replicate this, and it drove her crazy because all the students wouldn't tick a box. They said, well, no, I can't say Buddhist talk. I'm a bit of a Buddhist, but I'm a bit of that as well. And she felt she'd failed in her research. I said, no, you found out something really, really useful. And so I've written some people, talking about myself again, not take a non-binary approach and refuse to be labelled either religious or non-religious. That's probably the first time I put that in an academic piece of writing. And Audrey Broughton, though, she finds the concept of non-binary worldviews very helpful for including the worldviews of those otherwise categorised by themselves or other people as nons. And research all over Europe finds that often pupils' worldviews do not, as Audrey says, they do not conform to secular or religious, but they're more diverse. And she suggests using worldviews in what she calls a super wide sense, which I'm very much in favour of, inclusive of non-religious or secular and religious and non-binary, more complex personal worldviews that might relate to several religious, spiritual or humanistic ideas. And Audrey says that this encourages worldview reflexivity. She said her students were very interested in where do you get our worldviews from? And they were particularly, this was some time after the Anders Breivik terrible happenings and about conspiracy theories. Where do people get how do these things get into people's heads and their actions? How do people end up thinking and feeling and acting and identifying as they do? And where do the things in my head and where do my practices come from? So Nina's again, this is what's happening. People combine spiritual and religious positions with secular values into authentic and unified outlooks on life. And that's the important thing. It's not just it's not really whateverism. It's not pick and mix, which takes me back decades. It's people may draw upon many different sources, but they're not just muddled and confused. You can people make these into authentic and unified outlooks on life that work for them. So a non-binary identity means affirming that you can refuse to be categorized. You can refuse to have a label and say, I'm not going to be called religious or non-religious because neither of those work for me. And similar thinking also suggests that it's possible to draw upon two or many traditions. You can be a Hindu Sikh or a Buddhist Christian. I once met a Muslim, somebody who said to me, I was delighted in Bradford to meet somebody who said, well, I suppose I'm a Muslim New Ager. You can be multi-religious. You can reject the categories and boxes designed by authorities, either within the traditions and their boxes or by scholars and their boxes. So do we need new categories? Do we need to say people are religious, non-religious, multi-religious and non-binary? Or do we get in the danger of even more boxes? Can I say, well, actually I'm non-binary with a bit of religious? And I was saved from this by the concept of fluidity. And it sticks in my mind. Years ago, I was talking about my teenage witch research to some sixth formers in the sixth form conference. And I was talking about how a lot of the teenage witches found a viable sense of identity and belonging and who they were through identifying as witches. And we were talking about where people get their identity from, things like their friends groups and music. And one of them just said, why do you have to have a fixed identity? And I thought, you are right. We don't. And, our identities can grow and change and be different in different contexts. And so Nina's again, religious subjects are in a dynamic and dialogical relationship with the social context. I'm getting there. I've just got two more slides to say, well, what does all this mean for religion and worldviews and RE? So it's important to interrogate the notion of religion and education in RE, as Gert and Pat pointed out, as well as things like non-religious and spiritual. And the core worldviews approach makes it possible to say something like, my personal worldview draws upon both religious and non-religious elements. But it's more radical to identify as non-binary and query the whole thing. I get sick of writing. I think this is probably where all this came from. I was sick of writing religious or non-religious worldviews and just query the whole divide. It's also a further argument against the world religions paradigm in teaching RE, putting everything into isms. The super wide worldviews approach of AULRE challenges generalizations. It challenges stereotypes. It challenges accounts in social and other media. It challenges the fixed boxes that divide us. It challenges dominant constructions of particular traditions and colonial impositions, saying this is what you are. It encourages worldview reflexivity for students to interrogate the sources of their own developing worldviews. I sometimes wonder, do you ever think that, where even you have ideas in your head, you don't know where they came from and you wish they weren't even there. Also exploring, they can reflect on where their worldviews came from, and they explore the rich heritage of humanity's religious and non-religious traditions. And so this is a very inclusive religions and worldviews education, inclusive of all pupils and teachers, the religious, the non-religious, and the non-binary. And I think, given the option, there may be more of the non-binary than we think. It asks questions about sources of authority. Who says that Christians have to believe this, and whose experience counts? And I think non-binary might be very helpful for some students who otherwise have to identify as no or nothing or none, or if they can't answer the question, are you religious? And even for some who draw upon several traditions. I also think an identity as non-binary might be helpful for some RE teachers. And Graham Nixon and Joe Fraser-Pearson, their colleague, have done research on how RE teachers identify. And roughly 50% would call themselves non-religious rather than religious, if you have to choose between the two. And one of the titles of one of the pieces of writing was The Irreligious RE Teacher. But maybe they're not irreligious. Maybe they just don't want to be boxed into either religious or non-religious. And so the concept of being non-binary and refusing to be labelled either religious or non-religious is a liberating thing. It liberates you to be, in the words of the book about Life Isn't Binary I was talking about, you can be both, you can be beyond, you can be in between, positively non-binary, even though it's a non-word. And maybe we could liberate religion and worldviews education from constricting and distorting categories. And there I will stop. I have some other things and bibliographies of all of this.